And now we're going to take a look at Mannerism. And as I said a few moments ago, a number of the Venetian things we've already looked at sort of lean towards Mannerism a little bit. And we're going to be returning to Venice a few times during the next few slides. Mannerism is called Mannerism after the Italian word maniera, which means mannered. If somebody is mannered, like if we talk about somebody today and say that, oh, he speaks in a very mannered way, it doesn't mean proper manners, although that's kind of part of this, but it really means affected, almost too exaggerated, you know, very, very polite, or very exaggerated, almost in an awkward way. And that's really what maniera came to mean. Mannerist artists began with the height of the classicism that we have seen developing in the Renaissance, particularly near Rome and Florence. But Mannerist tendencies spread all over Europe, in Northern and Southern Europe. There were artistic reasons, historical reasons, and social reasons for the appearance of Mannerism all over the place at the same time. One of the reasons, if we go back to Italy, which is where we had begun our story, and Pontormo, actually, Jacopo Pontormo was one of the young artists that was part of the Italian development of Mannerism. Scholars often point to one particular moment, 1530s, right after the death of Raphael, that Mannerism really began. And it began with followers of Raphael. In fact, if you look at some of the very last works of Raphael before he died, you can see some tendencies that start to look a little bit exaggerated and aristocratic, very, very slightly. Now, Mannerism is considered, at least in Italy and in the southern countries, to be an aristocratic style, because with Mannerism, the intellectual, the idea, the concept, and the intellectual context became dominant. It was often more important than fidelity to natural appearances. So we can take a look at this painting, The Entombment of Christ by Jacopo Pontormo. There are a number of things, and again, this is a period that usually when I'm teaching in front of a class, I'll stop and say, okay, what seems unusual to you about this painting? And hands usually go up. There's a lot that's very unusual about this painting by Pontormo. I often say, what is the subject matter? The title says, The Entombment of Christ, but where is the tomb? The way the figures are stacked up in this composition, it looks like it could be a deposition. Remember, the deposition is the scene showing followers of Christ, apostles, Mary, taking his crucified body down off of the cross. That seems to make sense because of the way the figures are stacked. But wait, a couple things are wrong with that suggestion, because there's no cross. Jesus' body is here in the middle, but there's no evidence that he's been taken down from anywhere, as there's no tomb. And then, when you start to think about it, the female figure standing up behind him, who might be Mary Magdalene, it's kind of ambiguous. She could be the Virgin Mary, it's all very ambiguous. Where is she standing? Where is this figure standing? This is a seemingly almost nude figure. And for that matter, who is that figure? Is that an angel? Why is the figure seeming to be nude? I mean, it's very, or with a very transparent clothing on. It's a very ambiguous scene. There is no clear focus point. What we have seen with the development of perspective, etc., is artists becoming adept, becoming very skillful at creating areas in their paintings. They don't always have to be in the center, but creating an area which is the focus of your attention. They use various devices to lead us to the most important part of the painting, to convey the story that they're conveying. No such thing with Pontormo. Instead, we seem to have a confusing jumble of people in a very odd light. Look how the light falls on them and makes some of them look pink, some of them look bright, some of them look like they're in shadows in different ways, very inconsistent. And the center, which is the obvious focus point or focal point, particularly in such a confusing composition, the center of the canvas has all these hands. Very odd. In fact, even the body of Christ, you may have noticed this, the body of Christ and the body of this individual bent over, whoever that person is, with a very pink back, those bodies seem to be willfully distorted. Very perplexing. I don't know what the intellectual context for this at that time would have been. I think scholars do not have records of that. It's almost like an inside joke, not quite, but Pontormo's contemporary audience would have understood and accepted his exaggerations. And what we do know is that these exaggerations of form, of color, of composition, breaking with the rules of classical order, harmony, and clarity, these exaggerations create an intense emotionality, an emotional quality to the scene. So we can really think of Mannerism in this case and in many others as being a form of something modern that we'll talk about at the end of this semester, Expressionism. Because the purpose for Pontormo was more to express the intensity of this religious scene in a human, emotional way, rather than to depict it naturalistically as if it was actually happening in front of you. Verism, which means replicating, truthfully or faithfully replicating the appearance of reality, verism was not the goal here. Expression was the goal, and that's a characteristic of it is modernism. That's a characteristic of Mannerism. This gets even more fun. This painting, by the way, if you go to Florence, you need to go to the Uffizi, because you can't help but walk right out of the painting galleries past this painting. It's a big, beautiful painting. Reproductions never do justice, and I always try to find the best reproduction that I can. And this one is a little dark in the lighting, the way we're seeing it now. But this is called The Madonna with the Long Neck by Parmigianino. And it's named Madonna with the Long Neck. You can imagine why, because she has a remarkably long neck. To our eyes, the figure of this Madonna, just like in the last painting, the elongated figure of Jesus, the crucified Christ, or the exaggerated and extremely long pink back of the individual who's holding his legs, to our eyes, those don't look beautiful. They are not an ideal specimen of a human being in the sense of beauty. But at the time, the elongated forms, long slender fingers, long necks, long torsos, this was a mark of aristocratic beauty. So again, Mary's the Queen of Heaven, and she is being shown very elongated, being very elegant, and very courtly. Courtly is a good word for a lot of Mannerist painting, because it was absolutely courtly. Now, when I started introducing Mannerism, I said there were a number of factors that contributed to this. A painting like the Entombment that we just saw, a religious painting that is so expressive, might reflect the uneasiness that had occurred as a result of the Reformation, the Catholic Reformation. You'll recall in 1519, Martin Luther nailed 95 Theses to the door of the Cathedral of Wittenberg and effectively broke a large part of Northern Europe away from the Catholic Church. And there were other breaks with the Catholic Church. In England, Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church, and established the Anglican Church, which was not a Protestant religion originally, by the way. It was a branch of Catholicism that had deviated from mainstream Roman Catholicism, and he established Anglicanism, the Anglican Church, as the Church of England. The Pope and Vatican were losing control. They were losing their people, their flocks, and this made a lot of people uneasy. Society was changing. These shifts in the structure of society are very unsettling. That could be one of the reasons why, by the middle of the 16th century, Mannerism was a very popular style, particularly with the learned and aristocratic, wealthy classes of people who are concerned that the fabric of their society is being challenged. That's one of the explanations. Style becomes very important. I said she's elegant and courtly. Wealthy patrons now, in addition to the Catholic Church, wealthy individuals, not just dukes here and condottieri there and the Medici family here, but more and more there are wealthy aristocratic families and individuals, even women at this time, who are commissioning work. And they would get together to discuss matters of poetry, of literature, of music, of the arts, and style and elegance would enter into what they wanted to see. All of this helps to explain the unusual quality of Mannerism. It's not a full explanation, but it helps. So if we look at what's going on in this ambiguous painting, Madonna with her long, elegant fingers, she's very lovely. Her elegant clothing, her long neck, her very long and rather massive form, holding this Christ child. And it's okay, you're all thinking, that is not a cute little baby. He's not. And he looks like he might be 6 years old. But again, remember, this is an exaggeration for style and for evocative effect, for emotional, strong, or effect. In the distance, and we know this is the distance because of the positioning in space and because of the relative size, is a strange, unfluted column reaching up with no capital on top. It's not supporting anything, but a man in clothing from classical antiquity, some ancient Roman or probably ancient Greek individual, is reading from a scroll. Now, we don't know who that is anymore. So at one point, people knew who that was. Certainly, in the circle of collectors, in the contemporary aristocratic, educated, learned audience, they would have known exactly who that was. And so this would have made sense to them. Over on the side, peeking in a very crowded and strange space, behind the Virgin and Child, is this cluster of young people, presumably angels, but they look very contemporary, and this long, elegant, bare leg all the way up to the hip is very unusual. If this leg belongs to this torso and this person, it's a very weird twisting and turning position for the body as well. That's a characteristic that becomes prevalent in a lot of Mannerist painting and sculpture. Okay, we're getting weirder and weirder, aren't we? Bronzino, who was a student of Pontormo, I believe, so he's the next generation of Mannerist painters, was the favorite artist of an aristocratic woman who became very powerful. Not her husband, she actually herself became very powerful, Eleanor of Toledo. And she was a wealthy and influential patron of the arts with a lot of pull in various courts in different city-states throughout Italy. Very well educated, very learned. But this one actually was not commissioned by Eleanor of Toledo. I just mentioned her because Eleanor, she's important in the broad story of art because she was a woman who became a very influential patron of arts on the one hand, and she was primarily the individual who patronized Bronzino the most. In this case, however, it was Cosimo I of the Medici family who commissioned this odd painting that you're all looking at saying, what on earth is going on? And he commissioned it as a gift for Francis I of France, the King of France. You'll recall from our last lecture that Leonardo da Vinci ended up in the court of Francis I in the forest of Fontainebleau. And so Francis I was also a very learned, knowledgeable, sophisticated, aristocratic king who was a strong patron of the arts and of painting in particular. So this was a gift. And it is a fun and rather playful and fairly naughty allegorical painting. It's called Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time. And that pretty much tells you what's going on here. Here's Venus, beautiful young woman. Her body is in a rather uncomfortable looking position if we think about, you know, how to emulate what she's doing. And she's completely nude, but you know, she is the classical Roman goddess of love and beauty, so naturally she's nude. But her son Cupid is twisting rather strangely and coming up from behind her, fondling her and kissing her on the lips. Right there, that's rather racy of a subject matter, I would think. A very crowded composition again. The space is very ambiguous. People are coming in from all over the place. This figure howling over here in the background would be envy. That's allegorical, you know, representation, personification of envy. The masks that we see all around suggest deception. So this gets to be a very interesting and rather naughty story that's taking place. Folly comes rushing in to throw rose petals on the whole scene, this amorous, incestuous, lovely scene that we see taking place. And up in the top, over here, is time rolling back the curtain to reveal how these follies are playing out over time. It's not really a moralizing painting, it's just made for entertainment and enjoyment of the learned aristocrat. So this is one side of Mannerist painting. Now, the aristocratic side of Mannerist painting is a very important part of it, and also resulted in a new type of aristocratic portraiture. As portraiture, it's not going to be as exaggerated as some of these allegorical, religious, mythological kinds of scenes that we've been looking at. This is actually portraiture. And here is a portrait of the brothers and sisters of one of the first female artists that we have to talk about in the history of art from the Renaissance forward. There are not very many women who became accomplished artists, and most of the ones who did managed to do so because of peculiar family circumstances. If you take an upper level class with me, art since 1900, possibly if we don't get too far behind this semester, even in this class, when we get to the 20th century, I will talk to you about an article that was published back in the 1970s in Art Forum. It was Art Forum by a young historian then, whose name is Linda Nochlin. And she wrote an article and published it in Art Forum. The title was, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" You can imagine Nochlin infuriated feminists with the title of her article. And actually the content of the article was challenging to a lot of contemporary scholars at that time as well. Because her conclusion wasn't, well, because the patriarchal male society wouldn't allow them to be artists or wrote them out of history, which was at that time in the 1970s the dominant thinking. That's why we don't have more women artists. She said, well, yes and no. Because actually, for most women, being an artist, a professional artist, just wasn't one of the available career paths. In order to be an artist, you had to do an apprenticeship with another artist. You had to draw and paint from the nude. You really couldn't take care of a home and family and those other domestic duties. And most women in societies in Europe at that time were raised training for their role as the wife and mother and the female head of a household. And for that reason, there weren't a whole lot of women that managed, that on the one hand wanted to pursue a career as an artist, and on the other hand actually managed to do it. Sofonisba was an exception. Your book doesn't give her entire story. I'll try to make it brief because I'm trying to get us caught up on the syllabus, but it's worth saying a few words about how Sofonisba got there. This would be a great Hollywood movie someday. If any of you are writers or would-be screenwriters, you should think about Sofonisba's story. She was born to a family of several children, but when the children were very young, her mother died, leaving her father as a widowed man with a family of children to raise. Well, what usually happened back then, when that would happen to a man, either he would find a relative and let the relatives raise the children, or he would quickly marry again so there would be a substitute mother to raise these children. But Sofonisba Anguissola's father didn't do that. Rather, he raised his children as a single parent, which I'm sure he had help of servants and family members, and he raised them rather unusually. He allowed the girls and the boys to study the same things, participate in the same activities, learn the same kinds of lessons, and they all liked studying art. I suppose her father was an appreciator of art. In fact, I'm remembering he may have even done a little bit of art himself or something. So that was unusual, that she was encouraged to practice art and study art along with her brothers and sisters. But that still isn't enough to launch her career as a famous artist. Well, living with her father as an unmarried woman, she started creating portraits, and we're seeing a portrait, it's a later portrait, that she did of her siblings. And the portrait is a little bit stiff in some ways, you know, they're posing, but kids are going to be stiff if they're posing anyway. It is typical of the courtly, aristocratic style of Mannerist portraiture, because they're formal, they're stiff, they're not in weird poses or anything, but they look very elegant, very aristocratic, and very courtly. Although Sofonisba captures a little bit of their childish personality in a very tender, touching, very warm family way. This boy's holding the little dog and looking at you as if to say, uh-huh, and what? What? You know, arguing with his sister perhaps. This one is kind of smirking a little bit, and this one is definitely smirking disapprovingly at her brother. It's a very charming portrait. Well, this kind of portraiture got her note, or gained Sofonisba Anguissola some recognition, and I'll make the long story short, in the interest of time, she ended up becoming one of the favorites. Her work was seen by the King of Spain, King Philip of Spain, and he invited her to come, and she became to Spain, and she became the court painter, or one of the court painters to King Philip. She was particularly the painter of his young wife. Now, poor Philip had this misfortune that he would marry beautiful young women, and they would shortly thereafter die of natural causes. And so he was a widow several times, and he had a particularly beautiful young wife that he was attached to, and she loved Sofonisba, and Sofonisba loved her. It was a situation that was perfect. So Anguissola spent several happy years in the court of Philip of Spain, painting his wife and being, you know, one of her attendants. And then the young wife passed away. Well, Philip was left with a problem, because Sofonisba, I see if I remember this exactly, she was, I think, in her early 30s, basically an old maid at that point, since she wasn't married, and if Philip had to do something pretty quickly. So he put together a very impressive dowry, because he was very fond of Anguissola, and he found her a nice aristocratic husband, and they got all married off, so everything would be fine. And the next thing she did was take her husband and said, we need to go back to Italy to visit my family. So they got on a ship and sailed back to Italy. Unfortunately, her new husband, her wealthy, well-to-do Spanish husband, passed away on the sea voyage. But it's okay, because in the meantime, she had caught the eye of the ship's captain, and the two of them fell in love. So when she arrived on shore in Italy to bring her new husband home to her family, it was not the arranged marriage that she left with, but the ship's captain. But that was fine, because a ship's captain is gone for months at a time at sea, perfect for a wife who wants to stay home in Italy and pursue a career as a painter. And she had money left over from her marriage to the Spaniard. She had her dowry, she had means, and all was happily ever after. That's the story of Sophonie's Note. Okay. But you can see how her work is very aristocratic and very courtly, and that fits it in with Mannerism. One of the last two I have to show you is, we're going back to Venice, and we're now looking at the work of a man who was called Tintoretto. Tintoretto means little dyer, because he was from a family who made dye, clothing dye, to dye textiles. And I think his experience with the colors, growing up around colors, beautiful colors of liquid dyes, may have contributed to his expert use of color and brilliant effects in his paintings. I normally, when I put this up, I say, okay, we've seen a couple of Last Suppers in this class. We've seen Castagno's Last Supper. We've seen Leonardo da Vinci's famous Last Supper at Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. And now we have this, which is the Last Supper. When you first saw it, without looking at the title, I imagine a few of you wouldn't have even guessed that it was a painting of the Last Supper. Why? Well, it doesn't look like what we think of as a Last Supper. Remember, Castagno was one of the first artists we looked at to try to solve this problem of a coherent composition of people, 12 men, seated at a long table with Jesus in the middle, telling the story and all of that. Leonardo did it in a number of clever ways. We've already studied and discussed that. And now we have Tintoretto, and it becomes very confusing again. He has the table tilted at a diagonal. Diagonal lines and swirling lines now become part of the vocabulary of Mannerist representation. You remember classical harmony, think of Raphael's School of Athens, or one of his seated Virgin and child paintings. Think of Leonardo's compositions, think of even Michelangelo's work, not really the Last Judgment on the back wall, because that actually is kind of Mannerist itself. But generally, clarity, order, harmony are the hallmarks of the high Renaissance classical style. And now we have a departure from that. By using a sweeping diagonal, it makes the scene much more energetic and dynamic. In the foreground, some of you may have been wondering what's going on, it's a little genre scene. There's a maid washing dishes and a cat peering in to lap the dishwater, handing dishes to some servants who are over here, and they're big and they're really central in the front of the composition. I don't know if that is being traditionally part of a Last Supper. So how do we know who Jesus is and who the important people are? Well, it's pretty clear. Jesus not only has a halo, he has an explosion of light coming from behind his head with rays of light, almost as spectacular as this lantern, which is burning a flame. It's a real flame. It's not some spiritual holy flame, but look what is emanating around it. Angels, the heavenly host, they're coming in over here too. They almost look like ghosts, heavenly apparitions. Very exciting and mysterious and dramatic. There is high contrast of light and dark. Remember the Venetians, and Tintoretto is a Venetian. The Venetians were skilled at exploiting the Venetian oil painting technique to achieve effects of dramatic color and light. And Tintoretto pulls out all the stops. He exploits that to its fullest potential. The disciples have a glow coming from around their heads. That way we can tell who they are, since right behind them are servants and other people that seem to be unaware of this heavenly apparition that's happening around them as they go about their chores of serving the Last Supper to these guests that are seated at the table. A really interesting and ambiguous mixture. But the point again is not clarity of veristic, naturalistic representation. The point is to move the spectator. It's to be expressive, and with diagonals, with swirling compositions, with heightened contrasts of light and dark, and various distortions and exaggerations. Tintoretto absolutely achieves this goal. Now, in sculpture, the light and color effects were not as available. Even though the sculptures of antiquity were brightly painted, as we know, they didn't know that in the Renaissance. As the ruins of antiquity were excavated, most of the paint had worn off. So, and we've already talked about this, the classical Renaissance sculpture that we've looked at is the marble, the stone, the bronze is left its natural color. So you're not going to have color effects in classical Mannerist, I shouldn't say classical, in Mannerist sculpture, because they're not going to be painting them. That's just a defect in the marble that was chosen in this particular sculptural group. What Giovanni da Bologna does instead to heighten the emotional intensity, the dramatic effect, to make this scene, instead of the stable, classical calm of a composition like the School of Athens, the Mannerist artist wants a dynamic, exciting composition. So what he has done is piled bodies one on top of the other in a spiral twist and turn of nude bodies. Now, the subject matter that he chose for this, the abduction of the Sabine women, comes from Roman antiquity. It's a story where the Romans and the Sabines were two cities, groups of people in cities, city-states that were at war. And at one point, the Romans rode in and abducted all of the women from Sabina, took them away. It's called the Rape of the Sabines sometimes. It's often shown in paintings as a very dramatic and sometimes bloody and horrifying, scene where these women are brutally taken away from their homes and abducted to Sabina. Well, the second part of the story is that a period of time, a year or more, went by before the Romans were able to come march back into Sabina and rescue the Sabine women. And by the time they got there, most of the women had settled down with their captors, married, and were starting to raise children, and they didn't really want to go back. But anyway, that's a story. We'll talk about that story again later. But so the scene that this is titled after is the abduction of the Sabine women, that very dramatic moment. However, the funny thing is that the title was added after Giovanni da Bologna had completed the composition, because he really just wanted to make a sculptural group using contrapposto, exaggerated contrapposto, twisting and turning, to make a group of nude males and females interacting in the round in a heightened dramatic way. And so after he created this wonderful twisting and turning composition, he needed to find a justification, a reason for it. So he came up with, oh, it's the abduction of the Sabine women. See, another thing I haven't mentioned, but I'm going to mention right now, I should have mentioned along the way, this emphasis on exaggerated forms, on heightened color, on dynamic movement, all of these things that are entering into art and disrupting the classical calm of the High Renaissance can be considered an early example of art that was made for the sake of art. Not always. We've been looking at religious things, portraits, those had another purpose as well. But increasingly, as in the case of this, there's this notion of the artist making art for the sake of making art too. Finally, and I think your book includes this in another place. I'll have to go back and check. But this is a large painting that you'll see again if you take a 20th century class with me, because it was a major, well, not this painting, but the work of this artist was a major inspiration for Picasso's Blue period. This is an artist we consider to be from Spain, the Spanish government considers El Greco to be a national treasure. But if you think about the name, El Greco, he actually has a long name, Dominicos Theo Top. I'm on a video and I'm messing up his name. Very long Sicilian name. He wasn't Greek, he was from Sicily. But he had left Sicily and traveled through Greece and traveled all the way up to Italy and traveled through Italy and studied and then ended up in Spain after his travels through Italy. So he was a well-traveled individual. By the time he settled in Toledo in Spain, the Spanish called him El Greco, the Greek, even though he wasn't actually originally Greek. So we're going to look at the painting by El Greco. This is the burial of Count Orgaz. It actually is recounting an event that had happened much earlier in time than when he painted it. It was a historical event that he's commemorating for the town where Count Orgaz was buried. It's an interesting composition. We see St. Augustine helping to lay the Count. This is the deceased body of the Count. Lay the Count into the tomb. And there's a little boy standing here, some kind of attendant, looking out at the viewer and pointing directly to direct our eye to Count Orgaz in case you can't figure out which one he is. I think we could probably figure out which one he is because these two figures are framing him and everybody else is looking at him and he's central in the composition. The figures are all wearing courtly, aristocratic, Elizabethan-looking collars, those very strange, artificial, very uncomfortable collars. That was the height of fashion. The Mannerist courtly elegance, you know, this is the height of that. Behind the central scene, this man is also speaking and his hands are gesticulating, pointing again directly towards Orgaz. Behind is almost a single row of heads of distinguished people from the town. They almost look like disembodied heads because of their white lace collars, those stiff collars, and the black doublets or jackets that they're wearing. It's like a frieze of heads showing different expressions, but they look a little bit affected with that Mannerist tendency. And then, I don't know if you've been looking straight up from Augustine and up in the center, there's something unusual going on. Here's an angel, a ghastly white angel. I mean, their gray, white, blue tonalities are not warm and heavenly, although they are very spectacular and somewhat artificial, almost like artificial stage lighting. Where did my cursor go? So here's the angel. Can you see right here what the angel is holding in the angel's hand? Right here, it looks like a little baby. Well, that would be the immortal soul of Count Orgaz. The heavens are opening up. There's a funnel that's opening up in the heavens. The angel is catching or has caught the soul of Orgaz and is about to go and push the Count's immortal soul up to go reside in heaven with the heavenly host of Mary. Jesus is seated as the King of Heaven, not God, the Heavenly Father, but Jesus. St. John over here in his rags, and other saints and martyrs and angels, you know, in the heavenly host. It's a pretty dramatic scene. The figures are long and attenuated, and they're treated with a almost nervous energy that you sense from the colors and from the movement, the twisted turning movement of the figures. That quality, as I said, is something that modern artists are going to look back to. So this is the end of what I have to say about Mannerism, and we will continue next time looking at Northern Renaissance painting, or painting of the High Renaissance.